Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second Transportation Equity Caucus co-hosted webinar of 2024. My name is Axel Santana. I'm an associate at PolicyLink, he, him, his pronouns, and the chair of the Transportation Equity Caucus. Really excited to be here today, joined by John Bailey from NRDC, who will be talking through a resource guide that they developed recently. And quickly before I turn it over to him, just a quick introduction. John Bailey is the Senior Transportation Advocate for NRDC, where his work is focused on ensuring that new federal infrastructure investments through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act achieve their promised results at the state and local level. We'll look forward to hearing from him. In the meantime, as you're trickling in, please feel free to ask any questions as John is presenting. And we'll get to them at the end. We'll also be sharing this recording and any slides or other materials afterwards as well with caucus members and other participants on this call. So thanks everybody for joining again. Look forward to the conversation. And again, feel free to put in questions into the chat. And with that, I'll pass it to John.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much, Axel. I really appreciate the opportunity to present to you all. I can't see who's on the screen, who's there, but I feel pretty confident there's some people that I've worked with in the past or recently. So I look forward to getting some questions at the end. So I'll begin just by talking a little bit about why we put together this resource guide. And there really were two main reasons. First off, it's just there's, as we all have heard the stat 1,000 times probably, that there's roughly around $3 trillion worth of investments, if you include both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So really more money with the new deal available. The challenge we have is that state governments are largely in charge of a lot of that funding. And depending upon the relationship that communities, advocacy groups, city governments have with state governments, that can really work for good or ill for the kind of projects that we want that were actually built on the ground. So that's number one. We have state governments in charge of the funding. They do not always have the interests of cities and community groups at heart. And secondly, and I'm sure that if you all have worked with city government officials, you've heard this, it is just a fire hose of information that is out there. And in some ways, you can get sort of a stink eye sometimes from your chief sustainability officer or transportation director of the city when you bring up, hey, there's this new discretionary grant program. And oftentimes the reaction is like, gee, great, just what I need is another program to apply for. Because it's just an overwhelming amount of information, and the capacity to even apply is not there. So we wanted to not do an exhaustive report, but try to provide some real practical information about how cities can best speak the language of state government and use that funding and really demand funding in ways that both meets climate and equity goals. So that is the goal of why we did this report. I'm using the word report. So if you go onto our landing page, which I think you should have access to, if not, I'll share it when we're done with the presentation. There is both a report. There's also this slide deck as well. And we really, our goal was really to make it as accessible as we can, both the report, which I hope we've done a pretty good job of making it accessibly written, but also the slide deck that in 18 slides kind of talks a lot about what the message from the report. So the slide deck sort of the frosting and the report's the cake, and both are important. And we do think they should be read in tandem, but at the very least, I hope this slide deck is helpful. Quick point I want to make, that this report goes into both transportation, buildings, and energy. I'll mainly talk, since this is the Transportation Equity Caucus, I'll mainly talk about the transportation stuff in here. But I do think that finding cross-sectoral wins are really important as well. And oftentimes the way we spend that transportation dollar can help get us good housing results too, and vice versa. And we tried to include that information in the report. I also want to give a quick shout out to the people that helped to produce this. To the extent this report, I think, is written in a really clear, sharp, accessible format. That's to the credit of Mary Sue Barrett, who was a consultant that we worked with at NRDC, who really helped to put this together. And we had this incredible consultant team, which I can't speak more highly of, that kind of did a lot of the data analysis for us. And that was people that you all probably know, Harriet Tregoning and her team at Numo, Yona Freemark, who I'm pretty sure did a presentation for you all a couple of weeks ago, who, I mean, you want to meet somebody who really can draw those connections between housing and transportation. That really is Yona. And finally, an organization called Elevate Energy based in Chicago did a lot of our buildings work. So they are really responsible and deserve much of the credit for this report. Finally, as I mentioned, this is not meant to be exhaustive of all the programs, but we did identify 46 federal programs related to transportation, energy, and buildings. Also, more details on the policy and regulatory frameworks of different states. So this is kind of, will make it more relevant. Just to use transportation as an example, as many of you all know, there are sometimes constitutional prohibitions on using transportation in different ways that are really relevant for how you can use gas tax funding for transit, et cetera. Some states have so-called strong governors, some states have so-called weak governor systems. So we included all that in there. I also want to note that while there's a ton of information about all 50 states, we do have additional information on what we call our 5 deep dive states. And I won't belabor why those states, but basically those are states that NRDC has some additional capacity in. So Colorado, Illinois, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, we even have more information on those states. But what I would say is that while it's great for all 50 states, even if you're not in one of those 5 states, I think you'll be able to kind of draw out some of the data we have for those other states and use those to create your own, maybe not deep dive, but at least at least shallow dive to help make it more relevant for where you're located. So this kind of rockstar consulting team we hired did provide a tremendous amount of information and data and analysis. And about 2/3 of that we put in to the actual report. And again, that's a narrative that I think we've made an effort at least to write as clearly and concisely as we can. But we also did save all that information in appendices that I think is really helpful. In fact, most of the questions that I've received have been about the appendices. So again, that's both about the 46 programs, more details on those 5 states, and an extensive list of resources that are available on a whole variety of issues, and finally an appendix on a kind of relationship mapping. So, I'll begin, and as I said, we don't want to kind of repeat the sin of adding to the fire hose of information. So while the appendices does have kind of a list of programs, what we tried to do, and again, the audience for this being local officials and local advocates, are what really are some clear demands we can make of state government and state agencies. And we tried to kind of combine those into 5 different asks. And you can see them right here. I'll go into more detail on them, but this is what we tried to do. And I think sometimes just state governments, local officials, advocates are speaking different languages. So we tried to kind of create this in a way that is practical and are all things state government can absolutely actually do and provide real world examples where they have done that. I'll start with deepening local capacity, which is sometimes seen as kind of a blow off, kind of a small thing, kind of generic. It's actually incredibly important, especially if you're working in cities, small towns that are really under capacity cities and towns. So matching funds, I think the federal government has tried to provide less onerous matches on some of their programs. But even like a 10% match is just prohibitive for lots of places. And state governments have played a role in helping to kind of fill that gap. Sometimes also acting as fiscal agents. I'll also note this, I won't read them all, but this kind of third one I'll mention, the one in the center, about convening cohorts and really kind of creating that table to build that robust pipeline of innovative local projects. The pickle that we have is that sometimes the funding that states receive will only fund projects in the state plan, in the state plans. And of course, the challenge we have is a lot of the projects in the state plans are not the kind of projects many of us want to see. So we really do have to start the process of building that pipeline of the type of projects that are really going to benefit communities and people, and not just the kind of old projects of the past. Because I think if we are just doubling the amount of transportation money, which we're doing right now, but it's just going to fund the same old projects in a way where it's not just going to like keeping it even Steven, we're actually going to get things worse. So it's really, really important to kind of begin to develop that pipeline of new innovative local projects. I won't mention all the examples, but I will just suggest or let you know rather that The slide deck is mentioning a couple of examples, but we really tried to sprinkle a lot of these local examples throughout the report. And I'll just note, like in Colorado, the way they do this are 14 regional navigators. These are actual human beings whose job is to really help local communities bird dog, identify, and apply for infrastructure dollars. And that's again, can seem like a small thing, but I think is a really, really important practical thing that state governments can do to help local places. So I think this is probably an audience that has heard the flexing lecture before, so I won't belabor it too much. But again, I'll just say what I have to say really quick, is that we have these incredible discretionary programs through the infrastructure law. And we laud them, we celebrate them, we promote them, at least we do at NRDC. Programs like Reconnecting Communities and RAISE are going to demonstratively really improve a lot of communities that are out there. But that is still the kiddie pool when it comes to transportation funding, and it's kind of less than 20%. The overwhelming majority are on formula funds, and formula funds really are, for the most part, kept at the state level. And it just always, we can always repeat this, it never does not hurt to repeat it, that up to 50% of that funding can be used for different uses, whether it's walking, biking, transit, EV charging infrastructure. And our friends at Transit Center just released a great report, I think it was last fall, on this issue, and very, very few states are coming anywhere close to the 50%. The average amount is only 4%. So really, really important. Even the folks that are doing the best can still do so much more, and many states aren't doing it at all. And this is something that states, in fact, Congress, to their credit, it's not often I would say that, but Congress, to their credit, really has gone out of its way to say that this is flexible money for states. Many of them are literally called block grants, and yet it's still kind of only funding the highway projects of the past. I also really want to make note, and this again is to the credit to our consultant team, that really kind of banged home this workforce training funding available, and up to 100% of those formula dollars can be used for supportive services like childcare. I think that's a really important point to make, that I think if one of the big goals of why we all do this work is transportation work, is to move people to opportunities. Sometimes that means more asphalt or more buses, but sometimes there are other interventions that are just as important, such as childcare. And anybody, at least anybody who's been a parent, can relate with the challenge of finding accessible, affordable, and available childcare is a real detriment to people joining the workforce. So I really like to bring up this childcare issue. We talked to USDOT about this actually last week, and they brought it up as well. But it's really a message we really want to get out as much as we can. Again, in the report, we've tried to provide a lot of practical sort of examples like this, and visual examples. Frankly, I think it's done in a really kind of, we had a great designer who did some great work. So if you've ever met with a pollster about the amount of transportation money, they'll often tell you that after $10, $20 million, it doesn't even make sense to a lot of people. It's just such a crazy large number. So for that $100 million, what can we actually build? What can we actually buy? Here's the amount of like electric buses, sidewalks, bike lanes, increased frequency of buses as well. So we've tried to include that as well, so we really can get people a real practical example of what this funding can purchase if we think differently about how we fund transportation. If we don't, we'll only get the past. But if we think about new, innovative ways to use this funding, we can still make some real progress. Again, in the report, we provide lots of national data on pedestrian fatalities, which is a real crisis in states all around the country. I think in just about every state, they are only going up, and provide some specific policy prescriptions on how to make that better. I'll talk a little bit about vehicle electrification, and I'll mention that we try to do two things with this chapter in the report. One is making sure that the big picture, let me take a step back, is when we talk about electrification, we're not just talking about it in terms of like how to get more chargers in private garages. I think what our big goal is how to provide it more publicly accessible. And so we see the grant opportunities for commercial fleets, those are for cities, or for even private companies as well, that can really get electrification to scale. I know that I actually worked based in San Antonio, Texas, and did a little bit of work on the city fleet in San Antonio to electrify part of their city fleet. And it was incredibly jaw-droppingly hard to even get 10 cars changed. And because of some changes at the Treasury Department a few weeks ago, it's going to be much, much easier and simpler for cities to take advantage of this new resources. But even more importantly than that, to make sure when we talk about electrification, we're talking about shared electrification resources out there. And I'll just mention EV based on the Twin Cities. Some of y'all on this call may already be familiar with it. I think it's the largest example of an electric car sharing fleet out there in the country. Maybe I missed one and it's out there. Let me know if that is the case. But I think what's really awesome about EV, first of all, it really kind of blended funding both from federal resources, the Department of Energy, its utility, Xcel Energy, and also the Metropolitan Council, which is the regional government in the Twin Cities. And so provides a really innovative point-to-point car sharing service, all electric. But in addition, providing electric charging stations, not just for those cars, but for the public's cars as well. Again, it's really hard to charge an electric vehicle unless you have a private garage, and certainly most renters don't have that option. Some do, but the vast majority do not. So again, a really good example of, yes, it's focused on electrification, but also making sure that when we're talking about electrification, we're talking about shared use sources of electrification. We're talking about larger fleets of electric vehicles as well. So I know this is the Transportation Equity Caucus, so I won't go too much into the buildings efficiency work, but I will just note that one of the interesting, when I was working with the buildings peoples, that a lot of the things that we talk about innovative new uses of financing and about flexing financing are true for that as well. And one way that the IRA was written is that instead of just funding only like solar panel on a building or heat pumps for a building, but really a whole building approach. So especially including apprenticeship examples as well, so that the funding is going to like making the entire building energy efficient and making sure that the people that are making those efficiency improvements happening are coming from the local communities as well. So a tremendous amount of money available for electrification improvements and decarbonization improvements. I should say decarbonization instead of electrification. And I'd also just note, of course, I'm always interested in finding ways that we can make sure location is as much of a part of it, because that's kind of one of the best ways we can make buildings actually efficient in the real world. And the amount of funding available, especially new funds, you see these four listed here, but I'll just mention the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. For those that aren't in that loop, I encourage you to get in that loop. It is just an extraordinary amount of resources that are available. And at least state DOTs do have capacity, because transportation has always received a lot of money for the last 70, 80 years, for better or oftentimes for worse. But the state energy offices are woefully underfunded. So creative ideas on how to use these new funds, which again are probably 30 times what we've received in the past, are really, really important. I won't talk to you about building codes. And I talked to you a little bit about workforce opportunities. But it does bear repeating just the amount of jobs that are going to be created in the next 5, 10, 15 years, in the like $5, 10, $15 million worth of funds are really, really important. And like transportation, absent interventions, absent communities and advocates asking the state to do things differently, we will only be able to see the same results we've gotten into the past. And especially with the aging workforce, especially in all these trades, it's really important to make sure that when we're building these projects, we're using union labor, we're using local communities, we're finding apprenticeship opportunities, and that funding goes towards that. We at NRDC released a report on kind of ranking all 50 state DOTs around the country. This came out in November. And that's one of the things that we looked at actually in our procurement, was were they meeting minority and women-owned business goals? And some were, and many were not. And that's going to be incredibly important as we start kind of hiring and building all the projects that we're funding. And that's the end. but I'll say the most important thing, I mean, like any report, we really hope gets used. You hope somebody uses it, doesn't just go up on the shelf or into the shared drive, as we say nowadays. But even more than most, this one we really hope its only practical value is if it's used by people. And so if there are other institutions, tables, organizations, people you think can use that, please let me know and reach out, either through the chat or I'll put my email in the chat as well. And if this is something that you would like to share and you would like to use, I'd love for you to use it. And if you want to follow up with me and figure out a way that you can tailor it best for your state, I'm here to do that. You want to figure out a way we can kind of cut and paste slides in a different way, I'm here to do that. So hopefully, if it's me presenting, great. If it's one of you all presenting, that's great too. I think with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to some questions. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that. And a reminder to folks, if they have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function and we'll ask John live. While folks are thinking and processing what you shared, I have a couple questions, John.
Yeah.
Based on the presentation. Can you share a little bit more about how advocates can ask their states to use their flexible funding for walking, biking, infrastructure, and public transit? So more clearly, like what are some of the mechanisms that they can go about doing that?
Yeah, and so I'll kind of go a little bit into the weeds because I think it is important, and I've gotten my hand politely slapped a couple times about this, so I'll share with you what I've learned. We oftentimes use the term flexing to talk about this, and that is true for transit. And so technically what you're doing is you are flexing the money in the highway account, or I should say the formula account, and you're flexing that the FTA, Federal Transit Administration account. So it is important to be clear that is really a transit thing. The good news is that when it's for walking or biking, you're just using the money differently. It's not, you're not asking anybody to do something they don't have the permission to do. The transit is probably a little bit of a heavier lift because you do have to sort of get permission to do that. So that is a real, they have to talk to FDA, they have to do it. But for the other issues like walking, biking, or EV charging infrastructure, it really is just kind of demanding and asking them to do it differently. In practice, when I'm saying things like, well, you talk to your state DOT, that's kind of an intimidating thing to tell people to do. I think, and you would probably expect this, the most important thing are talk to city officials and city council people, I would suggest, especially city council people that serve on the MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization. So we have city councils and the MPOs. I think every MPO has city council people on that, and they're the people to kind of begin that conversation. So I would not start with calling your state DOT unless you happen to have really good connections. I would start with your council person serving on MPO and begin to have that conversation with them. Because I think if that person, if you can provide all the correct information to that person, they'll be able to articulate it better to their MPO staff. Because I think I've even found, it's fine amongst friends. We talk about this, it's flexing, it's great, it's wonderful. And even somewhat progressive MPOs will look at you like you're an alien if you talk about this, and look at you like you're crazy. And so what the report does have, I hope, and follow up with me if you want more information, anybody on this call, to provide some real examples of where that's happened. So you can at least get past the threshold of, you're a crazy person, we can't do that. It's like, I'm not crazy, or I'm not, I shouldn't have said that. How we can really do things differently. And here's how 5 other states have done it, and here's why we can do it too.
Awesome, thanks for that. And then the Minneapolis EV program, looked really cool. Is there anything being replicated or expanded in other cities, areas across the country that you've seen that are similar in scope?
I don't know, and I should know. I used to know the world a little bit better than I do now, but I can find out and get back to you. Like it's just I'm just such a remarkably big fan of it. Our NRDC team is actually going to hear from the EV team in a couple of weeks, which I'm very excited about. And not only because I'm a big believer in car sharing, but to me, it just illustratively tells a story of how we should be thinking about electrification. I think better than it's talked about now, especially in the press. So that's kind of why I like to bring it up. But it's a good question. I just don't know if other cities doing it right now, but I can find out.
For sure. And yeah, just the future of driving, right? Like rethinking how we drive and, carpooling, car sharing, all that. I think it's a
Yeah.
great way in making sure that it's like, yeah, electric and accessible to different communities as well.
And I'll just the weeds, but my favorite thing about it is I don't know if any of you all ever lived in a city that used to have car to go, but it was point to point. Part of the challenge with car sharing in the past is that you have to kind of take it back to the original location. And the idea is like you can get to the place and leave it. I don't know. I just think it makes it so much more practical. That I miss that.
Yeah, for sure. And then towards the end, you were talking about, jobs and workforce
Yeah, yeah.
opportunities. Can you share a little bit more about what kind of climate related jobs, will be created through this funding? And, if you have any recommendations around ensuring sort of local or targeted hire and other priorities that folks might have.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of it has the two big places are renewable energy, like battery plants in Georgia is a big thing. There is just I'll just be honest and frank. There has been this kind of interesting phenomenon where the overwhelming amount of at least renewable energy projects that are being funded are funded in so-called red states. So there's been this kind of interesting. It's just a thing that's happening where there's an irony there. Either I don't know if that makes it a better opportunity or a more challenging opportunity. I don't know, but overwhelmingly battery, and then of course just the regular transportation projects that we have. And I think, and we've gotten some. There's a great organization called Good Jobs First, which some of you all might know. A guy named Greg Leroy has been the director of it for a long time. And talked to him about this exact question. And as he said, you know, central labor councils sometimes kind of run the gamut. Some people really get this, some people really don't. But that should be people's first. If you're in an existing coalition, first phone call to see if they're talking about this, if they're interested in this, especially to the extent that one thing Good Jobs First has available is information on, well, that transit projects produce more jobs than highway projects. Our friends at Smart Growth America released a report on this about 10 years ago, which I think is during the Obama stimulus. And this is just as relevant now. And they also not only create more jobs, but also different kinds of jobs. And so different unions and sectors benefit sometimes from maintenance and transit jobs. Maintenance jobs also can produce jobs faster because you're not, instead of a new bridge that may take 6 years, this is actually kind of the mill and overlay that can actually start hiring people in the next 3, 6, 9 months. But your central labor council should be your first phone call.
That's a great reminder. Appreciate that, and a great takeaway. I think that's all the questions we have. Is there any sort of final remarks, closing thoughts you'd like to share with the group as we close out?
No, I think actually in your email to people or the invitation, did you provide the website?
I did not know, but we can do that in
Okay.
follow-up materials.
Okay, if you do that in the follow-up, I won't try to find it right now. I should have thought about that. I'm sorry. But take a look again, and as I said at the end, that I'd love to get this to more folks, either by email or presentations. So please let me know if I can be helpful with that. And I provided my email in the link, and I'm available. So thanks again, Axel. I appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you, John. And thanks everybody who was able to join us. Again, as we mentioned, we'll share the recording, the slides and the report and other links as well. So folks can follow up and, follow up directly with John as well if you have any questions or other things you want to talk through. So thank you for the time today, John, and thanks everybody for attending. We'll talk to you all soon.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.